where he's doing research on underwater devices that will enhance communication between scientists for coral reef and marine life presentation. Are we ready? So please welcome Professor Kastner. Sorry.
I'm really honored to be here. I'm not sure why I'm here, actually. There's a lot of great speakers. So what I wanted to talk about was kind of about computing and revolution of computing. And I call it a re-evolution. So I'm going to talk about revolution and evolution as well. So I want to start off with kind of the beginning of time. And this is computer science. Seems like a young field, and it is a rather young field, but it's actually quite old, or computing is quite old. So we can start back thousands of years ago with the abacus, and most of the great civilizations take claim to the abacus. But this was actually an instrument for calculation, so for storage of computation. And so then we skip ahead quite some time to the 17th century, where a number of researchers, Pascal, if anybody has programmed Blaise Pascal, was a tax collector, or his father was a tax collector, and he made a machine in order to help his father compute the tax a little farther. Other things like the stepped reckoner and Schickard's machine all did some sort of calculation just to make computers, and computers at that time were people, because they computed things, to make that much easier. And so then we go to something called jacquard's loom, and this is the first type of control. So jacquard's loom was actually a way of weaving rather intricate rugs or tapestries. But the major innovation here was something that, if you've done computing much longer than I've done computing, looks like a punch card. And so that allowed the loom to actually control what sort of threads would be moving, so you could actually make the types of tapestries that you wanted with that. So that's a huge innovation in terms of computing, and also in terms of weaving at the time. And then Charles Babbage was quite an interesting character. He was rather insane, like I guess a lot of great scientists are. Made a couple of machines, neither of which he really finished, but the one that he was the second machine that he spent lots of money and lots of time on was called the analytical machine. And this was considered by most the first general purpose computing machine. And he had a programmer by the name of Ada Lovelace. So another language, a computing language called Ada, was named after her, and she was considered the first computer scientist programmer. And then skipping somewhat forward to the war, at that point we started using computers for, I guess, something useful or something maybe not so useful, computing trajectories of our munitions, essentially. So these were massive computers the size of this room, computers that took enough power to fuel a city. So these were 250 kilowatts on that order for these computations. And there's a famous saying at that time by a gentleman named Howard Aiken. He was a professor at Harvard, saying that we would only need 2 or 3 computers in the world to do our computations. So going on a little bit further, Kilby and Noyce introduced something that became extremely important for the growth of computation, the integrated circuit. So this was, at this point, just a couple of resistors, capacitors, transistors that you could integrate onto a small or not so small piece of material. And then going, Gordon Moore and Noyce, I believe, started Intel in 1965, and Gordon Moore plotted about 4 points on a log scale, timeline scale, and said that it looks like, or I predict that from these 4 points, that we are going to grow exponentially in terms of the number of transistors in an integrated circuit. So looking on that a little bit further, his first 4 points were, or 5 points were in the 1960s. He made this prediction in 1965. And then you can see different types of computing technology, so memory, computation. And this is Gordon Moore from Intel. So we have to do Intel-type chips, but you can see it rather graciously followed that exponential line. So this was an idea of a home computer. a prediction of the home computer from 1954, the home computer of 2004. So this was Rand's idea of the home computer in 2004. So it's a great little steering wheel there. This is the 4004. This is one of the first Intel microchips used to power calculators, the Japanese calculator. And I'm just going to go through kind of quickly what's happening. And the innovation or the revolution here is the number of computers per person. So we started off with Aiken saying, okay, we only need 3 or 4 for the entire world. And now we're going to start seeing that we're going to have a lot more computers per person as time goes on. So this is the first Apple. This is the first PC. This is a computer near and dear to my heart, so I put that up there, the Apple II. Big cell phone, so I don't have the great stories that the previous Marty had. But the cell phone I like to call the Zach Morris cell phone, and that usually dates me with my students, but I might date myself with that thing. Zach Morris was a character in Saved by the Bell, which I used to watch as a kid, and he would carry around a Marty-like cell phone around for that. This is the ThinkPad, the first ThinkPad, so kind of the start of laptops. That is the first iPad, or the Newton, as they like to call it back then. And then the iMac. So this was starting to look. I remember seeing this and saying, where's the box for the computer? Everything's to become integrated. And then Wi-Fi was a huge deal. So I still remember looking for hotspots. We don't have to do that too much, unfortunately, now. But even computing and not having to plug in my Ethernet cord was just a huge revolution. And then we've gone to sensors, many sensor networks that have permeated our lives. And so if we look around this room today, we probably have, I don't know how many computers in this room, lots of computers in the back. I can see that right now. And each of us is probably carrying at least one or many more computers. So the number of computers per person has started, so the computers are overtaking us, right? So hopefully they don't become sentient. So that's kind of what I seen kind of up until a few years ago. And then I want to talk about the next revolution. And this is going to be really biased to the research that I do here at UC San Diego. But I think that the next revolution is using these computers to do something useful, and not just for computing, but for science and tech. So I'm going to go through a bunch of these examples very quickly. But before I do that, I want to look at this quote from about 10 years ago, saying that the embedded computers, so these are computers, embedded systems are computers that you don't think of as computers. So we don't think necessarily of our phone as a computer. We don't think of other devices as a computer. It's not something you sit down in front of and type and have a keyboard and a mouse. They predicted that this would be a revolution or would dwarf the milestones in the information revolution. So I want to kind of go through each of these and just give kind of examples of what you can do with computing. So computing in the sense of helping other sciences to do their research and to understand basic properties of the world. So the first is in biotechnology. So this is a project that we're working on in my lab. We're working on with a couple of bioengineers and a couple professors in the bioengineering department. And what they're doing is they're trying to understand heart function. So they want to understand the mechanics of the heart. And the way they do that is they can use cameras, and then they can dye the heart color, and then with this fluorescent dye, the heart will change colors as the voltage changes. So instead of putting, say, probes all over the heart, what we can do is we can actually perfuse the heart with this fluorescent dye, and then videotape or take an image of this heart, and then at the resolution of that image, we can tell the voltage. So if you look at the bottom left there, this data comes in. The voltage is inversely proportional to the dye. The intensity of the dye is inversely proportional to the voltage. So we do a lot of signal processing, and we flip it around, and essentially what we get out is a heartbeat at pixel resolution. So this is done very quickly, 1,000 frames per second, 100 by 100 images. And this whole process takes them approximately, for 3 seconds of data, so 3 seconds of video to film the heart, it takes them approximately 24 hours to analyze this, to do this analysis. So the big issue here is they do their experiments, and these experiments are already quite long experiments where they either just want to study the heart or they want to actually study the treatments to help us stop having heart attacks or help us recover after heart attacks. And they can't understand what the treatments are doing. They have to sacrifice animals in order to pull out the heart. And they can't understand what's going on while they're seeing it. So if they can get this data in real time, they can actually modify their experiments and not have to go through this long, laborious process of going through the whole process of treating the animals again. So this is what it looks like. On the left is the raw image, and on the right is the real image. So that's a real picture, and the intensity, again, is proportional to voltage. So you see as it flashes, that's a heartbeat essentially moving across. And the video is playing on the left. It's just, you can't see it. So that's what's all the image processing for. That's what 24 hours gets you, essentially. Okay, another thing that we're looking at is analyzing cells. So they grow lots of cells, different types of cells, stem cells especially. And they don't have a very good way of figuring out what cells they want and if these cells are good for their experiments. So essentially how they do this now is they have a lab tech sit there, or they have an undergrad sit there, or they have a graduate student sit there and look at the microscope one by one through the assays and say, okay, this looks good. This looks like a good cell. And so this is a perfect thing that we can automate. And so these are two cardiac stem cells that I'm showing, a very mature one on the left. And what you want to do is you can dye these in different ways, and you can have the dyes bond to different types of proteins, and those proteins will correspond to different parts of the cell. So we can have a dye that binds to the nucleus, and then we can identify the cells, and that allows us to say, okay, here's this many cells in this area. And then we want to look for these striations or these patterns because it indicates a mature muscle cell, in this case a mature heart cell. So we can quantify this using computer vision and eliminate the human from the process. Okay, so I do a little bit of work of financial computation. This is a pretty hot topic these days, especially value at risk. This is something that probably a lot of us would have liked to have, or a lot of banks would have liked to have, to make sure that we're not making too risky investments. Asset allocation and option pricing. So as you probably have heard, about a month ago, there was a massive drop in the Dow very quickly, and then it rebounded. And a lot of people, they just don't know what this is from, but a lot of people think this is from algorithmic trading. So most of the trades that are done on Wall Street in different stock markets are done via computers. Okay, and they're analyzing huge amounts of data, huge streams of data, coming in, quickly analyzing whether or not I should trade or not. A lot of the global scale issues. So it's seeing bleaching. There's a lot of the crown of thorns. And the way that they do this is they have a bunch of these sensors that they deploy. And these are different types of sensors. So a thermistor is just a temperature sensor. Wave tide pressure gives you the tides and the waves. ADCP is an acoustic Doppler current profiler. So this is measuring at a very fine resolution the currents going above it using acoustics. CTD is a conductivity temperature depth, so using this in some sort of formula gives us the salinity of the water, and ADP is essentially the same as ADCP, so it's measuring the currents. And the way they do this is something that they lovingly call FlipperNet, and so they take these instruments out, they dive down, they deploy these instruments for 6 months to a year, and then they leave them there, and these instruments sample themselves, they sample happily until they are retrieved. They store all the data locally, and then the divers retrieve them, offload the data, pull them up, offload the data, and disseminate that data across different sites. So the scientists there are very visionary, I think, in terms of marine scientists, and they want to use technology in order to go from something that's called FlipperNet to something that's much more modern. So I'll quickly go through a bunch of the technologies that we're looking at. So one thing that we're building in my lab is an underwater acoustic modem. So we're trying to wirelessly send data underwater. We can't just throw our cell phones underwater, unfortunately. I've done that a couple times. It cost me quite a lot of money. We can't even waterproof our cell phones and throw them underwater because RF just doesn't propagate very well. So we're stuck with acoustics. So we're stuck with talking with dolphins and whales at very, very low data rates. So hundreds of bits per second, thousands of bits per second at best. So what we're trying to do is take these costs, which these costs for acoustic modems these days are on the order of $5,000 to $10,000, and make them much cheaper. So we're building a $500 modem in my lab that we can attach to these $100 temperature sensors to make this vision of dense underwater sensor networks a reality. Okay, so robotics are always fun. So one thing that we're looking at is something called a drifter. And these drifters are, they're at the will of the currents, but they can control their depth via an oil-filled piston. And the idea here is the marine scientists love this because it gives them Lagrangian data. So it gives them data as the currents are flowing. And there's lots of interesting scientific questions that they can answer with understanding this data. So how are the nutrients flowing? How are the fish eating these currents? Where the current? They have a lot of these, actually, about 3,000 of these actually deployed. Not these ones, but much larger ones out in the ocean now. They just kind of drift around and they pop up every once in a while and send their data to satellite. These are called Argos floats. So what we want to do here is make tiny ones, and we're about this big right now. Me and my collaborators, I say we in the royal sense. That's a lot of people that are doing all this work. I just get to come here and talk about it. So there's a lot of great people doing this. We want to get them to much smaller and allow them to talk to each other acoustically because they need to know where they are locally. And they want to be able to say, okay, sample more, sample less. I'm seeing something very interesting here. Okay. Another thing is we're building is an underwater vehicle. This is the Stingray. This is, I think, an amazing vehicle, not only because it's an amazing vehicle itself, but it's a vehicle built by a bunch of UCSD undergrads over the past 2 or 3 years. And so the Stingray is supposed to look like a stingray. Some people think it looks like a Klingon war bird of prey. But we'll take either, I think. It's an autonomous vehicle. It has very unique propulsion, which I think is why it's quite amazing. 2 voice Schneider propellers. These are used on tugboats, and they kind of spin around in circles with blades on them, and it allows you to give you any motion in a plane. And then 2 of these allow you to give you very agile motion around. So these are great for coral reefs, because we don't want to bang into the reefs. Most AUVs are missile-like things. So I don't have time to finish this video, but I'll do that in a second. Vision, just quickly. Detecting things underwater, buoys, mines, depending on who you care about. This is possible. Keep going. Using sonar and optics, I think, is a very interesting area. And then doing fish, we have a project with the Southwest Fisheries Center here at Scripps in order to identify fish and figure out how many fish there are, how large they are, in order to figure out fishing policy. Okay, so that's, I think, what's going to happen in the next couple of years. And I'm very, very eager to see what the next revolution is. And I think students like, I think Irving is speaking next, one of the UCSD students will be the future of that. And I'm very excited to hear what he does and what he does in his future. Thank you.